We are in the process of moving through the pages of the Gospel of Matthew and now find ourselves in Matthew chapter 23, just one verse here, verse 4. I will be reading from the Amplified New Testament. Matthew 23 and verse 4 says this: They tie up heavy loads hard to bear and place them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not lift a finger to help bear them. It is the case that the Christian faith is presented by some as a burdensome pursuit of some future pie in the sky. In contrast to this is the freedom that is yours when you reject the shackles of religion and its dogma. In part, this is the case because there are people found within the Christian faith, like some of the first century Pharisees, individuals who create a system of belief and practice that is exact and precise. And I would say, as an aside, I think when it comes to people like this, that it comes down to probably to a degree personality types. I think there are some personality types that fall more readily into this in the straight and narrow sort of mindset, the legalism sort of mindset. Individuals create a system of belief and practice that is completely exact and precise. In that sense, the medieval Cathars, who were the perfects, are spiritual descendants of the first century Pharisees. In that sense, the early 20th century fundamentalist movement in North America, there was a lot of that within the movement. And I think if you hear such stuff, men wore ties of a certain color, you could not do certain things on a Sunday. There was a list of rules and practices that defined what it meant to be a Christian. And there is a side of belief and practice in the church that fosters this. The question becomes whether the church and the gospel message should be rejected, because there's always been this side which wants to turn the faith into an endless list of rules. Yet, surprise, surprise, you go out into the world and look at things and you go, what happens when we throw off the shackles and chains of rules and morality? Take the sexual revolution and what has happened there. Is there freedom to be found? Well, what has emerged? There are questions about sexually transmitted diseases. There are questions of what is right and appropriate behavior. At what point has a person crossed a line and been too forward? There are questions of what is permitted verbally. Does what you say offend me, put me down, belittle me? There are questions about birth control. Then there are questions about child support. Obviously, if the first question isn't addressed, the second one will come up. Then there are questions about visitation. The point is that the supposed freedom and spontaneity promised within the sexual revolution has become swallowed up in rules that come into play. My point is, you know what? Legalism exists in part because of personality types, and there's a reason for it. But there is no sense in which you can ever find freedom. Freedom eventually has its own cost and price to be had. There is a side of the Christian faith that has to be born out of personal experience in Christ. The failure of a faith experience that is rule-based is that there are no end to the rules that have to be created. Let me offer an example from my own lifetime. I became involved in a church movement which said no to Christians going to the cinema. Well, by the time I joined the movement, that rule was basically obsolete because home box office first started its service on cable in 1972, according to Mr. Google. And so what happens is, I could be a very fine Christian in that tradition and never go to movies. I just have to flick on the home box office and I could see what I wanted to see. The point is that it's not that the act of watching movies that is actually wrong. You can watch all sorts of movies. That's not the issue. The issue is what type of movies are you watching? And here we get into this whole problem where it's far easier to set up a list of rules and say if it's G rated in Disney, that is acceptable, and if it's R, it's not. And unfortunately, it's not always that easy or straightforward. Some of the most antithetical or movies that are most against the faith can be G rated movies. And at the same time, R rated movies, while they may have their flaws, can provide a serious opportunity for you to engage and reflect on your faith, even though it may not actually be a faith based movie. Now, I'm not advocating just any movie will do. Obviously, movies that are filled with gore and violence and vulgarity and all sorts of sexuality are not really forms of entertainment. And needless to say, even as I talk about movies, I show my age because I know that video games are now the go to form of entertainment. And those standards that were once applied to movies now need to be applied to video games. On the one hand, there is a danger when we create a church experience where our faith is in the rules. We do not look to Jesus, but whether we are keeping the rules. And in particular, what we can do is be faithful to the rules and not faithful to Jesus. And this is where legalism utterly fails because our movement, what we are moved by and motivated by, is being seen in the right light. And the way to be seen in the right light is keeping the rules. So legalism ultimately fails. Yes, we have to have standards and some rules, but most of all, we must, from our faith, engage the world in its values. We cannot find little pockets of freedom from the world. We must live and operate in a world that is contrary to our faith. And we must not readily accept what is offered up in our world as good and normal. That is why to be Christian means we inevitably become countercultural. All cultures are fallen and broken. A Christian who is no different from the prevailing culture around him or her is not ultimately Christian. And a rules driven religious experience will not make this happen. The only thing that will make it happen is a real and authentic commitment to Christ lived out daily.